the MTSS director at OSPI. And first, I want to thank you for spending your day with us during your summer. And second, I want to take a minute to just inform you that if you prefer or need closed captions, that is available. You should be able to select it on the bottom corner of your screen. And then I also want to give a special thank you to Northwest PBIS. They have been instrumental in putting today's event together. Kaiser Permanente has been very generous to help make this available and freely available to everyone, as well as the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center at the UW Smart Center, and numerous partners within OSPI, both helping with some of the technology and facilitation, as well as some financial support to be able to deliver this support today for free. One reminder is that as we are going through today's, not just this session, but throughout today's sessions, everything's going to be recorded, available online at the OSPI MTSS page. And we're going to build off of today's content throughout the year. So we know that just a one and done kind of thing is good for building some initial knowledge, maybe correcting some misunderstandings, that kind of thing. But we also know that ongoing support is and coaching is how we get things done. So on Fridays, through once a month, we'll dig into each topic from each session a little bit more. So we hope you can join us for those. And with that, it is my privilege to introduce you and welcome, and welcome RJ Monton. He is a friend and a colleague that works here at OSPI with me and has a wealth of experience and knowledge around MTSS, has been a district administrator as well as a teacher. So he's got multiple lenses and of experience in this work. So I am excited for the opportunity to have him share some of his knowledge and experience with us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to RJ.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. So good morning, everyone. Let me just get my screen sharing going here correctly. Thank you all for being here. Happy already middle of August. It's sort of hard to believe that we're already here. Hopefully you are all seeing, hold on one second here. Sorry about this. Hopefully you are all seeing screen 2. You should just see the slide MTSS 101, Dispelling the Myths. Can I get a thumbs up from folks?
I see you.
You see me still, okay. I thought we just did this. Okay, so now you should be seeing a blue screen.
Correct.
And how about now?
Perfect.
Okay. All right, so technology, here we go. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Again, middle of August already, pretty hard to believe. And hopefully you're all in the right place. So hopefully you are here for this MTSS 101. And while we won't be talking about Minotaurs or oracles, we will hopefully be adding to your knowledge and taking a look at some of the common misconceptions around MTSS that are out there. So we'll get into a little bit of like who I am. So just so you know who is sharing their information with you today. And I do actually, before I even get into that, I know there was a land acknowledgement during the keynote, but I do want to recognize that I am coming to you from the ancestral lands of the Suquamish, Muckleshoot, Duwamish, Stillaguamish, and Coast Salish First Nations people. But who am I? So I am RJ Monton. I use he, him pronouns. As Justin said, I am the Assistant Director of MTSS here at OSPI, and more specifically within the Center for the Improvement of Student Learning. My background is my undergrad is in outdoor recreation. So much of you are having the same face that my parents had when I told them that. So yeah, my background is outdoor recreation, but I applied that at a school residential school in New Hampshire where, we worked closely with students with pretty significant behavioral challenges. After a little while, I went back and got my master's in special ed and took over a self-contained K-4 classroom at that same school in New Hampshire. And then it was time for my family and I to move west. So we ended up in Seattle, and I started working at one of our western side school districts here. And I was I guess a middle and high school special education teacher at one of our alternative schools. Soon after that, my supervisor at the time thought it'd be better that I lead up our district's PBIS and MTSS implementation efforts, as well as working with teams to support students who had some pretty significant Tier 3 behavioral needs. And then a couple of years later, she somehow convinced me to go back and get my administrative credential and lead that work out of the district office at the administrative level. So ultimately, that's how I ended up here, and working with Justin, I saw opportunity to to really work at a statewide scale-up effort. But know that while I'm here before you today, we all at times stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm fortunate to work with a fantastic team of folks here at OSPI, including Justin, who you've met, but Maria and the rest of the gang who support the work coming out of OSPI. So why am I here? And no, this is not an existential question. Today, we're going to take a look at 7 common myths heard or shared around MTSS. We'll take a look at what makes these myths, and then we'll try and look at the reality within them. This is a 101 session, so to speak. So hopefully you're here with one of these goals in mind. So either beginning your understanding, and that's awesome. We all start somewhere if we're new to MTSS or new to MTSS within Washington State. Or if you're strengthening your understanding, looking to deepen the tools in your toolbox or deepen your understanding. Or perhaps you're looking for ways to bring material back to your district if you're here representative of a department or a building, and you'll come away with some new ways of approaching the work so you can perhaps disarm any of the myths before they take root in your district or building. Or maybe you, like me, that first PD of the year, you're just looking for that booster shot of MTS excitement to drive you into the year. The summer, I'm sure for many of you, felt incredibly short after it feels like 2 years compressed into 1 year that we had the last couple of years. But moving forward, there no doubt that through this, you're going to be left with questions when we're done with our time today, and that's okay. Part of this process is exploring those questions that maybe you didn't know you needed to ask. And finally, and this is me trying to keep it light a little bit, you may be asking, why 7 myths, RJ? Why not 10? 10 is so much better. 10 is comfortable. Well, my goal is to keep you slightly uncomfortable today. So 7's an odd number. It's a prime number. It kind of messes with you and it makes you a little bit uncomfortable. And the reality is MTSS implementation work and sustainability is not comfortable work. It takes people out of their comfort zones, and that is how we all get better. So my goal is to keep you just a little bit uncomfortable today. And maybe a trigger alert, while I will be sharing some myths with you, you might be saying to yourself, that's not true, no way. Not in our school, not in our district. That's okay. That's totally fine. Or if it makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm going to ask you to maybe dig into why it makes you feel uncomfortable. And the reality is, if you've never come across one of these myths, if you are on the road to championing MTSS, you're probably going to run into one of these at some point. So with that, I hope you've all had your coffee. We're going to go through at a bit of a quick and perky pace, and we will have some time to stop and pause for questions. And I guess the best way to do that is to use the chat function. We've got a couple of folks in the background, so Justin and Patty, that I'll ask to kind of sort of catalog some of those. And after each myth, we'll pause so that we can kind of address some of those questions. I am aiming for a bit of time at the end to address some general pieces, but if we don't get to your question or you think of one afterwards, there'll be some contact information where you can reach out. And normally, while I've been a classroom teacher, and I always loved interruptions because I often felt my students were engaged at that point. There are a lot of you in here today, so I would say please leverage that chat function. Okay, so here we go. Myth number 1, MTSS is just another thing. Okay, so we've tried it before, and well, true, implementation is a continuous cycle of improvement. You have to try it at some point to start it, but ultimately there is no destination. So it's not as though you get into and you check the box and like, hey, we're doing MTSS. we'll dive into that a little bit deeper in a minute. It's another thing, it didn't stick. I would say, like, if this is the thing coming up, say like, all right, there's some error analysis in there. What was your fidelity of implementation? Okay, we'll dive deeper into fidelity. You know, if you're at the keynote, Karen and Corey talked deeply about sort of the fidelity of implementation. Did it go beyond a book study, or was it just on the walls, or rather than in the halls, so to speak? And my favorite I always hear is like, it's just giving kids rewards or awards. And we hear this quite a bit associated with the PBIS components, or the social emotional components of MTSS. And while recognition systems are a tiny component of MTSS, if we're talking about feedback loops, you know, providing positive feedback, that's a totally different concept. But if our view is that it's just rewards, that is absolutely a myth. There's so much more to MTSS. And also, we also hear quite a bit, it's a curriculum or a one size fits all. Those are tossed around, conform or get out of the way, all myths. And what we typically think of when we think of implementing something, historically, these innovations, they come in waves. And after the energy excitement of years 1 and 2, what happens is, oftentimes, if it's not sustained or there was no long range plan to sustain it, it ends up in a 3-ring binder on a shelf collecting dust. Okay, so the beautiful thing is that MTSS, you know, and we view MTSS not as a thing. It's not a curriculum you adopt, purchase, train on, check the box, and then can say we have MTSS. If we go about implementation in that manner, it's actually doomed. We believe that MTSS is the how. And probably the best way to look at this is, you know, to really go at dispelling myth number 1 is by using Washington State's MTSS framework as that example. So the Washington State MTSS framework is our evidence-based organizational approach, you know, for districts and schools to create those equitable, consistent, and flexible systems to support and empower students, families, educators, and communities, and benefit everyone, basically. That framework builds on a public health model. It's primarily focused on prevention and really looking at organizing all of the efforts of the adults in the system to become the most efficient and effective with their practice. And it consists of 5 key components: those team-driven shared leadership, database decision-making, family, student, and community engagement, community of supports, and evidence-based practices. So starting with the team-driven shared leadership, really continuous cycles of improvement are led by leadership teams, whether they are at the district, the building, or grade level, or even subject, as we talk about larger, more comprehensive, you know, secondary schools. It's about organizing and supporting the adults, like I said before, to produce to make their efforts to produce the positive student outcomes. We need to have the right people at the table on these teams. And oftentimes that comes down to expertise and experience over job title. So while you may have a job title around director of something, if your expertise isn't in data and you need someone at the table around the table that has a data expertise, you get that person there. And then this is mentioned before, fidelity, fidelity, fidelity. We need to look at how well the system is working and not just how it's producing outcomes. And you know, we talk about how the teaming is important and it relies on the team. And you know, I think Corey and Karen touched on this morning. Like during the implementation phase, there are human catalysts that are doing some of the initial heavy lifting. But these individuals should not be creating systems that become dependent upon themselves. So really, as that catalyst, it requires that energy to get going, but really that energy should be being put into the system to support the ongoing nature of MTSS. So with that database decision-making, one of the things we've often heard, and I've heard this quite a bit over the past couple of months, is we have, you know, districts saying we are data rich, but we're information poor. Or we've heard leaders express that they want to improve data literacy. So this is around, you know, teams using multiple sources of data, but also need to be evaluating if they even have the right data in the first place. So when teams come together and they identify a problem, asking the question, do we even have the data or access to the data to address that problem? So as we keep going, like, please stop me, like this is sort of a flip comment, but please stop me when we get to the part that sounds crazy or what school should not be doing. You know, so when we think about family and student engagement, students and schools existing communities. It's simple as that. We have some walls that separate, that keep things in, keep things out, but ultimately schools existing communities. And education really is something that families and students participate in, and it should not be something that's happening to them. And with this, I want to make sure we have this bias alert. Many of us in education have had positive education histories. We either enjoyed being in school, or it wasn't detrimental, or it wasn't a negative, or it didn't create trauma for us. This is not the case for everybody. And in a lot of cases, it's why we came back to work in public schools. So there are many who haven't had that positive experience, and it's their stories that we really need to sort of listen into to hear that can help us improve. It's not finger pointing. It's like, okay, here's a group of folks maybe that we are not reaching effectively or not producing the best outcomes for. We need to hear their stories so that we can apply it to our work to improve our practice. And then evidence-based practices. We are going to dig into this a little bit more through some of the other myths, but ultimately this is around the intensity and individualization of support should be matching the student, family, or the staff need. I'm sure right now, as we're talking about continuum of supports, and the word tiers is up there, you're conjuring images of triangles, and I promise you, this presentation is not devoid of triangles. So also with evidence-based practices, as Karen again and Cody touched on this morning, we need to be employing those practices that have been proven to work. They are either based in research, or they have evidence to support their effectiveness. So, and again, for the flip comment, things like clip charts, somehow those rooted in schools, and we know there's no evidence to support that actually changes behavior for students. We need to rely on actual evidence-based practices. So recap, we have these five components of MTSS, and I see a little bit going on in the chat. I'm not watching it, but I'm gonna pause if there was any specific questions around myth 1.
No, I just linked the framework document to the chat box.
Okay, perfect. So continuing with our quick and perky pace here, diving into myth number 2, it's just a triangle. And I also hear that this doesn't work for me or my field or my role, or I don't see my thing on the triangle. So we often hear that, I've worked with schools and districts where the implementation, the first stage was like, okay, draw the triangle, put everything we're doing on the triangle. That becomes so overwhelmingly like chaotic on the triangle. And I think there's a bit of a knowledge gap where it's sort of like, okay, let's just get everything on there, and we can show where we're doing MTSS, and we can see where there are gaps, and we can do some things there. For that practice, I guess, so for those of you who are instructional coaches and evaluators or administrators, when we talk about the idea of depth of knowledge, that's sort of like a level 1 depth of knowledge practice for me. So like a DOK 1, that just listing everything we're doing doesn't really move us to any sort of systems improvement. So yes, the triangle is sort of the hallmark, or the character, like the physical representation of an MTSS model. But and even in my former role, I used to joke that I was required by contract that I couldn't have no less than 13 triangles in any professional development I ran. But here's every time I put a triangle up, at first glance, we would get that reaction. We get hey, I don't see my thing up there. Where's early childhood? Where's ICAP or HICAP? Where's counseling? It's the reality is schools are complex. And like I said, if we try to put everything on there, it's not going to work. So this goes back to the concept of multi-tiered system of supports being a how rather than a what. And where I'm going with that is, instead of spending the time trying to find the triangle that works best for your district or represents everything you're doing, think of the triangle more as a tool to help bring people back and evaluate their work. Think of it as so we'll call it a 3-tiered whiteboard, only it's green, yellow, and red. It's a tool to help us systematize and evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of our professional efforts. So ways to think about this, we can begin asking questions, with this tool, saying are our universal efforts reaching enough students? Do all students have access to universal supports. And it's not just for students, and we take this tool. An HR department could apply this to their practice. Like, do our employee support efforts provide universal accessible support for 80 to 90% of our workforce? Not only in the professional context of, of content expertise, but also, like, are we creating warm and inviting environments so that our teaching staff can be the best they can possibly be? And the maintenance department, like, is our physical plant capable of keeping up with what we need? So every single department, every single field, every single, focus of work within a district can apply their practice by using this model. Does our effort, or is our effort reaching everyone, and are our efforts providing that success, our core efforts providing that success for 80 to 90% of whatever group we are supporting? So whether that's technology or food service or transportation, everyone can apply this thinking to their field of focus. So I'm going to pause. I saw a few more chat things pop up. Were there any? Yeah,
There was a question around examples of evidence-based practices. I shared the What Works Clearinghouse link. If you have others that you want to share, that would be great. Otherwise, that is one resource. And then there was also a question of getting a copy of the slides, and we will post all of the slides from all of the sessions to the OSPI MTSS webpage. And I just put the link for that in the chat box.
No, thank you, Justin. I think the What Works Clearinghouse would be the place that I would point people, just because, looking at it would depend on what context you were asking about the evidence-based practice, whether it was within academics or behavior. I think one of the things to think about, my background's primarily behavior, so I would say, like, with evidence-based practices, looking at, providing behavioral content, providing behavioral instruction in context rather than, excluding student from context. So we know with plenty of evidence that the more you exclude a student from the classroom or from their peers and take them away from examples of the behavior we're hoping to see, the less likely it is that they're going to reproduce that behavior. So I would say definitely, Justin's spot on with that. Head over to the What Works Clearinghouse. That has probably the most comprehensive list. Okay, go back to my slideshow here. All right, myth number 3. And for those of us who have the special education background, trigger alert here, MTSS is just a pathway to special education. So heard this is coming up more and more, and often associated with this, we hear that we need MTSS because the discrepancy model for qualifying students for specific learning disabilities going away. So now we get this perception that it's a race for schools and districts to implement MTSS, because the question is, how else can we get students into special education to get them the supports they need? So these are things that we're hearing. And again, this may not be true in your district, as I said in the very beginning, but these are things that we're bumping into pretty routinely. So also associated with this, we hear that the MTSS model is a wait to fail. We have to try an intervention, let it fail, try another one, let it fail, and then we turn to special education. These are myths, and these are also misunderstandings of MTSS on a higher scale. So within IDEA, I'll zoom in for you here. We want to be building the most effective and efficient and effective processes to produce those positive student outcomes. So permitting the use of a process based on a child's response to scientific research-based intervention. So really, this is not, to get away from the wait to fail model. This is, all right, we're going to intervene as early as possible. And that's the brilliance of some of our MTSS systems, is that they have really early warning signs built into them to intervene. So really, it is not that wait to fail. It is more intervene and scale up that intervention as necessary as you're monitoring that progress monitoring, I should say. So within Washington State, while the process of MTSS may be the path that leads to a student receiving special education services, it's more than that. So it's really the process about how we go about school, and the special ed supports exist within that. So rather than, the idea of waiting and doing nothing, and then, when a student has that discrepancy, then they qualify, the process of MTSS intervenes earlier, and allows for better support of students. So again, the whole change in the efforts around early intervention, you're seeing that come out in legislation. You're seeing it come out in bills, within the state. And the use, as I said before, and we can't stress on this enough, the use of those evidence-based practices and progress monitoring are essential. So, and a good note that we need to make is that we are actually using progress monitoring tools which leverage like that validated research. So there's, like I said, there's that difference between monitoring progress, which is informal, and while that's essential, great teachers are using both of these concepts at the same time. We need to be actually progress monitoring to make sure that, to help us inform decisions about the needs of our students, and do we need to intensify the level of our support for students, or are they making progress? So make sure that with these evidence-based practices, we are also doing that progress monitoring. And so finally, as we wrap up this myth number 3 around special education, rather than saying we should be implementing MTSS so that we have a pathway to qualify students, really we should be thinking about it. We should be implementing MTSS as an effort to intervene earlier and make our time and effort more impactful. We feel that MTSS can do much to reduce the over-reliance we're seeing on special education services. And I'm not saying that we should be shirking our child fine, obligations, but since MTSS is not a wait to fail model, it will provide that earlier intervention and will most likely thwart unnecessary reliance on special education services. All too often, I've seen a current practice that we supplant core instruction for students receiving special education, and really MTSS, when implemented with fidelity, curbs that behavior within systems. And we end up with these core plus models where students aren't removed from core. They are getting those universal supports along with their peers, and they get on top of it specifically designed instruction that they need. So pause for questions around myth number 3. Looking at the chat, it looks like Laura posted some intensiveinterventions.org. Yep. Okay. So, let's see one more pop up. Yes, thank you, Gina. Good to see you again, Gina. Yes, but not a bridge, but yeah, we're trying to curb the amount of, I guess, students who are, the reality is, as we build these MTSS systems, I think we often find is there's that gap in the middle between what buildings and schools and districts are doing as far as core instruction and core supports, and those individualized supports for students. There's that in between, like we typically call that tier 2. Those lesser intensive interventions, there seems to be that gap there, and between struggling with figure out how the funding piece of how that might work and how we reorganize schools to provide those early interventions. That's where that gap is, and that's where, as we get deeper into MTSS implementation in schools and districts, those pieces come to light, and it becomes easy as we develop our systems, or easier. It's never easy, it's education. Sorry. So, and then here we go. Myth number 4. Well, we can stay on the special education trend here. Heard that special education is separate. Special education is tier 4. So first, and again, flip comment warning. I feel like there is no tier 4. If we have already defined our tier 3 interventions as those individualized intensive interventions, I can't imagine what tier 4 would be. That would, to me, that's to the point where we're intervening at the level of genetic engineering. I don't know what tier 4 would be. So second, special education is not separate. It's not separate. It's a service and not a place. And the more that we can, again, put our mind into thinking that, like, okay, special education is a set of individualized services for some students delivered, in context as much to the highest degree possible, we can begin to see, like, okay, it's a service that's provided to students and not a place that we send students. In reality, in a well implemented MTSS system or MTSS model, special education exists across and through all tiers, so to speak. So we talked earlier, remember we talked about the triangle being that visual tool to examine and organize our work. We can do the same when looking at special education practices. So think about how do the folks with the special education expertise begin sharing their knowledge for the benefit of all. So we think about our PLC models, our teaming structures, how are special education teachers being included in looking at that core instruction through the lens of universal design for learning? How, like, are they embedded in the classroom? Are team teaching or co-teaching models being used? So they're in a continuous, in a multi-tiered system of supports. Special education exists across all tiers, because we'll talk about another myth in a minute. Our students, exist through all tiers. So the other thing is, like, with special education, thinking about how individual student teams, collaborate to support students. I've often, I've been in a lot of places where, they say, like, okay, tier 3, that's special education. It's like, well, and oftentimes what happens is there's this view that the only thing happening, the only thing existing in the tier 3 level of supports is special education services. But that's not the only tier 3 support. So a student can be receiving an individualized support for any number of reasons, but not be a student who qualifies for special education services. So that's an important distinction to make. So, like, in thinking that, like, okay, we've established that special education exists across all tiers. There is no tier 4, and it's not a place, it's a service. So, and if we think about that from the standpoint of inclusionary practices, again, flip comment warning. Imagine if we had a way to continuously monitor and address the effectiveness of our core instruction, our services or supports. So with MTSS, we layer in those supports and we don't remove core supports for intervention. The more our intervention is combined with the core, the more impactful it is. So it's this idea that, I think we've gone to the practice of removing students from their core classes, and removing them from context in order to provide the targeted instruction, oftentimes with a different curriculum that they need. And we have, I don't know how many years of data showing that that's not actually closing the gap, but yet we keep doing it. So MTSS is a way to sort of change that practice within special education as well. Every time I slide screens, I lose my keyboard controls. So pause for questions. And Justin and Patty, I hope you're watching them if they pop up. Okay, I'm seeing them directly. It was posted. So it said, so there's a comment saying, it says districts must use MTSS to provide interventions to students at which grade. Oh, so that was, so the dyslexia, great question. That's from Miriam. Beginning this year, beginning in 21-22, and as provided in the section, each school district must use multi-tiered systems of support to provide interventions to students in kindergarten through 2nd grade who display indications. So that's around the dyslexia bill. So while this is not, we're not going to go too deep into that. So really it's about that process, of screening, identifying early, using evidence-based practices, progress monitoring. And then in the case of the need to increase intervention, if students are not making progress with their goals, then we would do that. Justin, do you want to add to that?
I do not have anything to add to that. I was going to share the next question that came into the chat.
Okay.
And
Is
that
that,
is,
oh, yep.
can you give an example of a student with tier 3 supports not receiving special ed?
So yeah, so so if a student has an acute need, I mean, so here's one of two things can happen. Yes, so one, as acute needs pop up, yes, a student may at that time qualify for special education services, but oftentimes in a true MTSS model, if an acute need pops up for a student, that whether it could be around transportation, if they need help getting to school for if an accident has happened, there are individualized services districts can provide. This is the can and have to sort of like side of things. So we can provide those services for students. When it comes to mental health components, there are students that at times need intensive individualized mental health supports, but it doesn't necessarily need to be ongoing. So remember is like with qualification for special ed services, students have that documented disability, and that disability exists into forever. With tier 3 supports that are needed, sometimes a student may need an intensive individualized service and support to be successful, but it may not be because of a disability, it may be because of an acute or temporary need.
Yeah, can I piggyback on that a little bit, RJ, too?
Absolutely.
So we can also be thinking what even take a reading intervention. Like as we're going up those tiers, we're becoming more individualized, more intensive, and those individual needs, if we're working on phonemic awareness or something like that, or we're working on a social skill or behavioral skill that student just needs more support and more individualization. It doesn't have to be driven by an IEP or eligibility with an IEP to be able to access that. Sometimes we also see within behavior things like wraparound or FBAs, functional behavioral assessments, being done to individualize supports that are not part of an IEP or special ed eligibility.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. Okay. You're all still seeing my screen, right? I clicked too many things. So yes, so thank you for the questions. So, and moving forward, myth number 5, and this one, so this is a trigger for me up to full transparency. So MTSS only further labels students. So this is, the MTSS doesn't label students. We, the adults in this system, label students. And, I think person first language is absolutely essential. We add labels to students mostly to be efficient with our speech, but it's dehumanizing, and it ultimately, we say all means all. As soon as we add a label that puts a student into a category, and it really goes against our thinking of all means all. And some of this is sort of brain science, like our brains want to categorize things. It makes our behavior more efficient. But I expect that no one in this session believes that they themselves should be categorized by any one facet of their existence. Therefore, we shouldn't do that with our students. So what I mean by that is we can take a look here at George. We don't label students. Students are not tier 1, they're not red students, or they're not on a tier. We really need to strive to avoid language like that's a tier 2 kid or he's on tier 2. Rather, it'd be better if we approached the tiers as a structure that supports come in. So the supports that students need to be successful. And to be successful in the aspects of their life. So with that, it's a better statement would be, this is a student receiving a tier 2 support for problem solving. And we can compare this to academics. So students have an academic profile too. So they may respond to tier 1 supports for math, but need individual tutoring or tier 3 supports for reading comprehension. And the other thing to remember, as Justin had talked about, we tier 2 and tier 3 supports, they are not necessarily permanent. A student's not always going to need a tier 2 or a tier 3 support to be successful through school. The goal is to know when to fade that support, because the school day is limited in time, and any time we're spending on the intervention, as much as we keep them in core, and much as we try and provide it in context, there are elements of that participation. With 100% participation with core, that does get sort of like there's some friction exists. So if you need like another further example, and this is my favorite one that someone told me years ago, like imagine so we all work with students who have some intense, behavioral challenges and behavioral needs or support needs. And so I want you to imagine your student who has the most intensive, behavioral support needs. So you're already thinking like, yeah, I have to do some very individualized things for that student. In most cases, I'm going to bet that they have fantastic attendance. They show up every day. So they are there. And that's so to call them a tier 3 student is completely inaccurate. So there's something about what's supporting them. The attendance piece is working, so they are making it to school, oftentimes to school with 100%, like with close to like perfect attendance and universal supports. Staying in the classroom, staying engaged, because their behavior may interfere from that. So like depending how we had defined attendance, we could argue that, but really think about it. So we can't call them a tier 3 student. They are a student who is receiving some tier 3 behavioral supports. So that was a short myth, and it's person first. And I will say that a few years ago I took on like this idea, like, all right, I'm going to use person first language all the time, no matter how many eye rolls I get. And I got a lot of them, when someone, and I would correct people, and I was, people would be like, oh, there's the special ed student. I'm like, no, it's the student receiving special ed services, and at first, it upset people, but over time there was people who were sort of the folks who were pushing back on like, oh, you're like, it's just PC. It's like, no, it's not PC. We're talking about a human, like, who has so many more facets than whatever service they're receiving. So I like that became a thing. So I think the more that we can use person first language, the more that we can, as champions of MTSS, the more that we can demonstrate that, the more that people who maybe aren't aware of it yet will pick up on that practice. So I want to pause, make sure that we are keeping up with questions. Yep, I'm seeing some agreement around the person first. So yes, I too am an East Coaster. So yeah. Okay, Justin, did you catch any questions in there?
No, I was just gonna reiterate some of the chat, some great comments in the chat just about students fall on different places on the triangle, and that's based on that point in time and not a fixed thing. And it's the supports that we're labeling, not the students, and student first language, all of those things in the chat box. So thank you for that engagement.
Yeah, and so a personal example, I mean, I have spent a lot of my life rock climbing, and I can get away rock climbing with the universal standard supports of rock climbing. I feel fairly comfortable with that. If you're taking me on a caving expedition, I'm going to need some elevated supports. I'm going to need a social story about how to be appropriate when my anxiety goes up and I'm underground. So like, know that, but I wouldn't say that I'm a tier 2 or tier 3 person. I would say like for caving, I'm going to need some tier 2, tier 3 supports. For rock climbing, I can use the universal supports alone. So there are ways to look at this, like outside of education, that help adapt our understanding for person first language within education. Oh, it won't advance if I'm not right at screen. Okay, myth number 6: it takes too long. So this comic always makes me laugh. But I think yes. So this is a myth. It doesn't take too long. It takes too long because historically, we've not thought of MTSS as something. Historically we have thought of MTSS as something we are adding to our current work, trying to find a way to fit it into what we're already doing. So when we truly begin to understand MTSS, we realize that we should be fitting what we're doing into an MTSS framework that allows us to prune away some of the things that aren't effective or aren't efficient. So really, it doesn't take too long. The only too long about it is how long it's taken us to really get to the point of getting around to adapt to see it as a way to do our work rather than something to embed into our work. It is a journey though. You know, Karen and Corey talked about it. We're talking about adult behavior change. So we're talking about how the adults within the system change their behavior to provide for positive student outcomes. And because we are humans, we are really good at living in patterns and liking what we do. It's hard to disrupt those. Even, it doesn't matter how many statistics we can put in front of you saying like, oh, if you do this, it's going to be better. What I'm doing right now is working because I'm in my comfort zone. So one of the best examples, you know, I was thinking, I was like, how can I explain this? So when I was, you know, I turned 16, my dad was adamant. It's like, you're going to learn how to drive a standard transmission. So I learned. So to this day, I mean, my car is still standard transmission. I can drive through Seattle and I can hold a conversation and I can drink a cup of coffee while driving through downtown Seattle. It's, that pattern has become like just it's there, it's stuck. About 6-7 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to India for 2 weeks. And I had also had the opportunity, it was a necessity at one time, I had to drive a car. It was a standard transmission. Steering wheel's on the opposite side of the car, and the stick shift is with a left hand. And if you've seen the pictures of driving in India, I will say that they're not accurate. It's far worse than you can imagine. Like there's lanes, but there's no rule. Like the rules are totally different in the culture. They make sense and the context is perfect for their culture, but it was not what I was used to. I was way out of my comfort zone. So trying to learn a new behavior, I had to be deliberate about it. Ultimately, truth, I gave up. I wasn't going to be in India long enough where I thought I really need to drive. I was going to rely on public transportation. But know that if I was going to live there longer, it would have been something I'd have to put deliberate effort behind, is like learning how to do this in a way so that I could concentrate on what I was doing in front of me and not where I had looking down to move my hand. So we like our patterns of behavior. Disrupting them makes us feel uncomfortable. So that is why implementation does take some time, is because we're disrupting patterns or ineffective patterns of adult behavior. So again, you know, they touched on this during the keynote. We have those classic stages of implementation. Again, it is that journey of adult behavior. So the myth that it takes too long isn't true. If deliberate, it takes some time, and it will provide different and better outcomes. So doing something different, like I said, takes deliberate action. Learning a new language, learning a new job, you know, learning how to drive in a foreign country. While it's uncomfortable, it does produce those results. It takes individuals and teams towards their learning edge. So that's the outdoor educator coming out. I mean, it allows them out of their comfort zone to allow for the greatest expansion of your comfort zone, to include these new practices. So there is, you know, the science of implementation, you know, is there, and it's moving humans towards that organizational change. You know, you can't necessarily skip steps. You've got to make sure everyone, to the maximum extent possible, is sort of on the bus as it's moving. So that's why these stages of exploration, installation, initial and full implementation are super critical. So it takes too long if we try to accelerate it based on some external timeline that isn't relevant to our needs. So, and then we talk about implementation, we often wonder, are we doing it right? So fidelity is that measurement where it comes in that lets us know, are we doing it correctly? Is it our efforts within the system that are producing these positive outcomes? So we can't blame poor outcomes on a tool that was used incorrectly. And the flip side of that is we can't take credit for positive outcomes for a tool that we implemented incorrectly. We need to make sure that, all right, given this tool, we're using it the right way, and we're seeing positive outcomes. You know, or we have a tool, we're using it the right way, we're not seeing outcomes, perhaps it's the wrong tool. So as long we need to make sure that the humans within the system are behaving the right way. So we need to have that lens on fidelity. And I'm gonna make sure, hopefully this works, trying to test out sound. So this is, Justin has shared this a little bit. This is one of my favorite clips, Phil Strain talking about this concept of fidelity. Oops, pause for a second, Phil. We think of fidelity as this linear, like the better we get at doing what we're doing, we're going to see positive student outcomes. But I think Phil has a great way of explaining this.
The question of where fidelity fits in this whole notion about scaling up MTSS, it cannot be overstated. Here's the data as I understand it. High fidelity of evidence-based practice can actually be a great proxy for collecting the more expensive data on child outcomes. Because here's what we know, especially from the pyramid work, that when implemented to fidelity, kids make phenomenal behavior change. Here's what we also know. If you, theoretically, but also based upon real data, if you start off at 0 fidelity and you get to 50%, you don't get 50% of the child outcome that you would get if you were at 100%. Fidelity works as a threshold. It's not a continuous variable where 30% of this gives you 30% of outcome. It's more like once you get to 80, 90%, boom, that's when behavior change really kicks in.
So yeah, so I like this because this highlights, I think, one of the frustrations that happens within implementation. Those early stages of implementation, you're trying it like, well, why isn't it working? We're getting better with our fidelity, but we're not seeing the positive student outcomes. I think Phil like highlights that moment, like boom, you hit that mark, and then all of a sudden, like, okay, cool, now it's happening. So I think that's one of those pieces, as Karen and Corey touched on this morning, is like getting that churn that begins, that very beginning process, of implementation, whether it's MTSS or anything else. It takes time, and those early results, so to speak, can be very discouraging. That's why fidelity becomes so important, because that is something that you can then turn and say, like, hey, yes, we're not seeing the outcomes yet, but we know that science says like we need to get to a level of fidelity before we begin seeing that, but we're doing great on this fidelity. That keeps the motivation for the staff involved in the system going. So implementation of MTSS can take too long if we stop before we get to some of these points where we see that momentum happening. So I'm going to pause for questions before we get into our final-ish myth. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So I'm going to, because I'm looking at time here, I'm going to continue. So myth number 7, this is my favorite. We can implement MTSS without doing MTSS. And while this is a myth that I would say that we probably see more in organizational behavior than we hear people actually saying. So what we see is like, hey, quick, we have to do this MTSS thing. Let's create a department, or let's put George in charge of MTSS. So I think when we think of it as something that we can just like begin doing and checking boxes, that doesn't work. So it really, I think Karen and Corey touched on this cascading model of supports. So there is, in order to provide for positive student outcomes, we know that successful and long-term implementation and sustainability at the building level relies on the capacity support from the district level and so forth. So then the region supporting the district and the state supporting the region. Really, and all of these teams and these support levels have their own MTSS frameworks that they're operating in. They're evaluating data, they're choosing evidence-based practices, whether it's around implementation, if we're talking higher level, or whether it's around actual teaching strategy. So it's all of these layers should be engaging in an MTSS process to support MTSS. It's not that, okay, we're going to let George and his MTSS department take care of it. And again, looking a little bit more granular, perhaps from your focus, looking at the district level team, supporting the school level team and school staff and then students. So as we zoom further in, we see that these leadership teams are really designed to promote or provide for positive student outcomes. And within each cascading support, the higher level, so I hate to say it's not hierarchical, but the level that's further away from students works to set up systems and reduce barriers to allow for the next layer closer to the students, to the layer of the more granular focus, to focus on practices. That's, so it's really, the idea that, and this is something Justin said to me as I first started working at OSPI, is it's like, okay, if you're working on implementation at the regional level, I'm going to work on reducing barriers so you can do that. So really thinking about the idea, like, okay, like I'm focusing here, the layer behind me is reducing the barriers so I can be better at what I need to be doing. So the closer you get to the students, the more your focus is on practices, and the further away, obviously, the greater your focus is on infrastructure. So within each layer, there's some nuances. The science of the implementation and MTSS is the same, but the ingredients in the mix might be different. So to kind of wrap this up, and I think Karen and Corey again touched on this. When we think about, if we want to look at a simpler equation around MTSS implementation, and realize, like, I kept this pretty stark, but there's so much in this. But this idea that with effective interventions and innovations combined with effective implementation, that's when we get those effective educational outcomes. So the right tools, the right procedure for selecting and using them gives us the positive outcomes we need. And in order to figure out the right tools, we have to have the right data to begin with. So a quick pause. I'm trying to be cognizant of time. From that was myth number 7. Sorry about the typo. So I'm looking, so will teaching programs be encouraged to teach? Oh my gosh. Yeah, I don't have my soapbox here, but yeah. I think that depends on where in the country you are. 100%. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit. This is such a good question, and definitely something we're working on. We're working with the Cedar Center, which is a national center that helps support pre-service education programs. Definitely trying to make inroads around MTSS, and some programs are doing more than others. For example, Seattle Pacific, we are partnering with them around some MTSS stuff. UW Bothel's doing some really great stuff, but it's kind of a tricky target is what we're finding, just because of the level of autonomy within programs. So we are working to influence this as much as we can, and have definitely seen just over the last decade plus that I've been trying to do this, that it's challenging to have that direct inroad to change or influence in the way you want the pre-service programs.
So yeah, it's a great question. I mean, yeah, I mean, if you ever want to have a conversation later, I can tell you about how I'm moving out to the Northwest. I was all excited about coming to the crucible of MTSS, and I come from New England, and I was shocked when it was not what what I read in all the literature during my undergrad and graduate studies. So, but so because I know some of you are not comfortable with the number 7. We'll round it out to 10 really quickly if you're still feeling uncomfortable. So if that leaves you unbalanced, here are 3 free ones. A lot of times we hear, hey, we're not ready for MTSS. And this one is like, explain to me what that means. Like, not ready to take the first step, increase knowledge, the journey. So that exploration stage can be as simple as, hey, we're doing a book study. We're going to read something about it. So that is where it has to start with some knowledge gathering or some exploration. Second is, our school district or facility is too small or too unique, or all of our students are receiving tier 3 supports. Like, well, based on what? Because I worked in a residential school for students with pretty significant behavioral needs, and by public school definition, they probably would have been students receiving tier 3 interventions. However, the tier 3 interventions at the public school were our core universal supports. So MTSS structures and systems are unique and determined by the need of where they're being implemented. So whether that's at a district level, a school level, or a non-public agency level. So think of it in context of what does your population of students need, and that's where you begin. So, and then finally, MTSS is a 4-letter word in our district. So yes, implementation missteps are hard, they happen, and restarting is challenging. But when done deliberately, when it's made part of long-range strategic planning and tied together in specific ways, it can be successful. So.
That's fantastic. Thank you, RJ. And that last one, I think my former mentor used to say, a false start is not a neutral experience. So when we've had kind of those attempts that failed, you know, we need to reapproach, re-engage in ways that acknowledge that effort that happened, and just know it's not neutral, which also makes us, going back to some of the earlier myths, I think, really want to be deliberate in how we're supporting our educators so that they are seeing the impact, feeling the support to be able to make the changes that are being asked.
Awesome.
Excellent. Well, with that, again, all of the recordings, all of the resources will be posted to the MTSS OSPI webpage. We're hoping for next Wednesday for that, but I'm going to just say within the next 2 weeks, you should see them online. And we'll start the next session at 11 o'clock. And then 1 o'clock for the afternoon sessions regionally. So thank you all for your engagement, and we will see you soon.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity to connect with you all today.